Sam Nordquist, torture killing in New York, 2025. I remember exactly where I was when the first headline flashed across my phone. Not a dramatic headline, not the kind that commands attention, just a notification floating in like another piece of digital noise. Unusual death under investigation in New York City. Normally, that wouldn't have stopped me. Cities breathe tragedy every day. Headlines come and go, but something about that small sentence felt unfinished, like the opening line of a story that didn't want to reveal itself yet. I didn't know the name attached to it, Sam Nordquist, not then. But I would learn it, and like everyone else who followed this case, I would come to feel the weight of what those 3 syllables carried. At first, everything was vague. Authorities didn't give details. News outlets used the same recycled lines: pending investigation, seeking information, 2 individuals detained. It was the online chatter that shifted the ground beneath the story. People began whispering about a disappearance, about a man not seen for weeks, about something in an apartment that made even veteran officers quiet. And then it hit, the detail no one was prepared for. Sam had been missing for a month. Not only missing, but allegedly held captive. That was the moment everything snapped into darker focus. Because disappearing is one thing. People go off-grid, avoid friends, shut themselves away in the noise of adulthood. But being held, sustained, controlled, trapped for weeks inside a New York apartment, that wasn't just unusual. It was unthinkable. The first time I saw Sam's photo, it felt wrong that such an ordinary face was attached to such extraordinary horror. He didn't look like someone who lived on the edge of danger. He wasn't the type of person you'd expect to become a headline. Friends described him in ways that make the story hurt even more. Soft-spoken, gentle, the kind of person who existed quietly, without taking up more space than he needed. A familiar type of person, someone you pass in the street without noticing until they're gone. Some said he'd been stressed recently, but nothing alarming. Struggling a little with money, trying to keep up with life the way most young adults do. Juggling bills, work, relationships. The kind of struggle that makes you go silent for a few days, not long enough for anyone to imagine danger. And that's what makes the beginning of this case so eerie. There was no sudden panic, no frantic search, just absence. A gentle drifting out of people's daily awareness. The timeline leading to his disappearance was a patchwork of half-glimpsed sightings and vague recollections. A few people thought they saw him with acquaintances. Someone mentioned running into him briefly near a convenience store. Nobody remembered anything strange. Nothing suggested he was in trouble. Sometimes that's the most terrifying part, that the beginning of a nightmare can look so normal. When the police finally released the names of the 2 suspects, the public gasped, not because the men looked dangerous, but because they looked painfully regular, not the stuff of horror movies, not wild-eyed monsters, just 2 faces you wouldn't look at twice, ordinary in a way that sent a chill down your spine. Because if you expect evil to be obvious, this case teaches you otherwise. One neighbor described one of them as someone who slipped through life like a shadow, polite, quiet, eyes always on the floor. The other had more presence, sometimes loud, sometimes unpredictable, but nothing that suggested he was capable of real harm. People recalled little moments, awkward interactions in the hallway, odd jokes, strange moods, but nothing clear enough to raise alarms. Only in hindsight did those fragments feel like warning signs. When officers entered the apartment, they didn't walk into chaos. They walked into the kind of mess you'd expect in any cramped New York rental. Clothes on the floor, dishes in the sink, lights left on in rooms nobody was in. And that normalcy made everything else infinitely worse, because the horror didn't unfold in a dungeon or an abandoned basement. It happened in a place where people made coffee, watched TV, slept, argued, lived ordinary lives. A place where no one expects suffering to take root. The truth of what happened inside those walls emerged slowly, painfully. Police described a scene that suggested prolonged captivity, prolonged suffering, injuries that didn't come from a single moment of violence, injuries that told a story of days stacking on days, each one more unbearable than the last. Even seasoned investigators struggled to speak about it. That's when the public understood this wasn't a crime of impulse. It was something far colder. The idea of Sam being trapped in that ordinary bedroom, just feet away from people going about their day, is something that gnaws at you. You start imagining the small sounds he might have heard, the footsteps, the muffled conversations, the clink of someone making dinner, the ordinary world he could hear but couldn't reach. And that contrast is what makes long-term captivity cases feel so psychologically brutal. Because it's not just suffering, it's suffering while the world continues without you. People online became detectives, combing through every piece of publicly available information, building timelines, speculating about motives. They dug into the suspects' social media, looking for clues, hints, cracks in their personas. Some found strange posts, cryptic jokes, late-night rants, unnerving quotes. Nothing illegal, nothing concrete, but unsettling in retrospect, like glimpses into minds that were fraying. The theories about motive grew quickly. Some blamed drugs, others pointed to mental instability, unresolved trauma, or shared delusions. But none of those explanations fully captured the reality of a crime that lasted this long. Harm done once can be reactive. Harm done for 30 days is deliberate, practiced, sustained. It suggests a mindset shaped long before Sam ever entered their lives. But what happened on the day everything fell apart? Something shifted. Something broke. Something forced the outside world in. Police haven't revealed the call that brought them to the apartment. Whether it was a noise complaint, a welfare check, a mistake the suspects made. It remains sealed, but what they walked into was enough to change the trajectory of the investigation instantly. Officers felt something was wrong before they reached the bedroom, and when they did, they found Sam, and the hidden nightmare finally became visible. The arrest that followed sparked outrage, not only because of what the suspects were accused of, but because of how they reacted. Some witnesses said they looked numb. Others said they seemed irritated, as if inconvenienced. That lack of visible remorse ignited fury online. People wanted answers. They wanted emotion. They wanted something human. Instead, they saw blank expressions that explained nothing. As prosecutors filed charges, the legal language felt cold, too small for the reality it described. Kidnapping, murder, unlawful imprisonment, torture. Court hearings were short but heavy. Journalists described the atmosphere as suffocating. Every detail revealed was a confirmation of something the public feared but didn't want to believe. And still, so many questions remained. What exactly sparked the violence? How did two seemingly ordinary men maintain control for so long? Could anyone have stopped it earlier? And why Sam? Those questions form the backbone of every discussion around this case. They linger even when the news cycle moves on. They tug at the edges of your thoughts long after you close the browser. Because once you confront a story like this, it doesn't let you go easily. Most true crime cases have a moment where things click. A motive becomes clear. A sequence of events lines up, or a suspect's behavior suddenly makes sense. But this case didn't offer that kind of clarity. The deeper investigators looked, the more unsettling the story became, not because the facts were inconsistent, but because they didn't line up with any pattern people understood. It was as if the crime lived in a space between categories, too calculated to be impulsive, too chaotic to be fully planned, too prolonged to be a moment of madness, and too senseless to be given a rational explanation. As officers began assembling the timeline, one thing stood out immediately. Nothing about Sam's disappearance suggested he expected danger. He wasn't running from something. He wasn't hiding. He didn't tell anyone he was in trouble. There were no concerning messages, no hints in conversations with friends, no warnings in his social media activity. His life simply continued until it didn't. That gap, those lost days before anyone realized he was missing, is one of the most haunting parts of the story. Adults vanish all the time without immediate alarm. People assume someone is busy, stressed, or taking a break from the world. But silence can be deceiving, and in Sam's case, it masked a nightmare no one imagined. While the public tried piecing together the missing time, investigators shifted focus to the two suspects, specifically how their paths intersected with Sam's. Interviews with neighbors sketched a strange portrait. The quieter suspect barely acknowledged people in the hallways. He walked quickly, eyes down, as if trying to make himself invisible. The other suspect, more talkative, sometimes caused disturbances, arguments that spilled into the hall, loud music late at night, unexpected shouting. But even those behaviors didn't come close to predicting what was found in their home. Investigators learned that the suspects weren't close in the typical sense. They coexisted, shared space, but didn't present as friends in the way most people define it. Some neighbors said the energy between them seemed tense, mismatched. One described them as two different storms trapped in the same apartment. That comment lingered with me, because sometimes the most dangerous relationships aren't built on harmony. They're built on volatility. Two unstable people can create a dark kind of balance, each one reinforcing the other's worst impulses. Psychologists who weighed in online began discussing a rare phenomenon called co-escalation, when two individuals gradually normalize harmful behavior together until cruelty becomes routine, not because they share identical motivations, but because the absence of resistance allows their darkest thoughts to grow unchecked. This theory resonated with people who saw the case as something more complex than simple sadism. But theories can only take you so far, and the truth inside the apartment remained locked behind sealed reports. What became increasingly clear, though, was that the torture wasn't random. It wasn't a flurry of violence that spiraled beyond control. There were signs of restraint, signs of repetition, signs of someone shaping an environment to maintain dominance. Investigators hinted that items in the apartment suggested a pattern, a recurring cycle that Sam endured day after day, even without official details. The idea was horrifying. Torture isn't just pain. It's the distortion of time, the breaking of routine, the stripping of identity, until a person becomes trapped in the smallest possible version of their world. Imagining those days is unbearable. The dim room, the sounds from outside, footsteps in the hallway, neighbors unlocking their doors, conversations drifting through the walls. The cruel juxtaposition of ordinary life inches away from a reality no one knew existed. There's something psychologically devastating about being so close to freedom and yet so impossibly far from it. When the public learned that neighbors reported minor noises, thuds, quiet arguments, sudden silences, it sparked a wave of guilt. People questioned themselves. Had they ignored something important? Should they have knocked on the door? Should they have reported something sooner? But guilt solves nothing, and the truth is more complicated. In a city full of noise, distinguishing danger from everyday chaos is nearly impossible. People hear things, assume nothing serious, and move on. That's not apathy, it's survival. Once the arrests happened, the suspects' demeanors became the center of attention. One appeared detached, almost empty. The other seemed annoyed, as if the police had interrupted something insignificant. That emotional disconnect became a point of fixation for everyone following the case. If they felt nothing in the aftermath, what did they feel during the 30 days inside the apartment? That question alone deepened the horror. Prosecutors later confirmed that the suspects showed little reaction as charges were read. No visible panic, no confusion, no remorse. Their attorneys requested psychological evaluations immediately, feeding speculation that the defense might pursue mental illness claims. But public outrage made it clear. People weren't interested in excuses. They wanted answers, real answers, not clinical explanations or speculation. The medical examiner's findings were sealed, but whispers circulated. Injuries consistent with prolonged suffering. Evidence that Sam had been kept alive intentionally. No signs he was able to move freely. The kind of details that make your stomach drop, even when they're vague. Reporters said the sealed autopsy report was not suitable for public release, a phrase that speaks volumes without saying anything specific. Meanwhile, people online dug deeper into the suspects' pasts. They found old posts, dark humor, cryptic messages, fragments of thoughts that hinted at frustration or instability. But the internet is a dangerous place for amateur profiling. What looks sinister in hindsight often blends into the background of someone's life when everything is normal. People say strange things online. They make jokes, express intrusive thoughts, vent about their days. None of it means they're capable of unspeakable violence. And yet, in this case, those fragments feel like pieces of a puzzle no one had assembled in time. The most chilling part of the early investigation was the sense that there were still missing pieces, gaps in the timeline that officials refused to clarify. The exact moment Sam was taken, the moment he lost his freedom, the moment the suspects crossed the line between impulse and cruelty. Every gap was a ghost. Every silence was a question. And then there was the apartment itself, its walls holding secrets no one wants to imagine. The officers who entered described the atmosphere as heavy, a word rarely used in official cases. Heavy implies presence, something lingering, something you can feel even after the room is empty. Investigators said nothing more, but that one word traveled across social media like a cold wind. As the first week of investigation unfolded, people began sharing stories of near-miss encounters, moments where they passed the suspects in the hallway, moments where they heard something unusual, moments where they brushed past Sam before he vanished. It created a strange collective memory, as if the entire building had lived in the shadow of something they only recognized after it was too late. But the investigation was just beginning, and as the pieces slowly came together, one thing became clear. This wasn't a story about a single crime. It was a story about the space where ordinary life becomes indistinguishable from horror. A story about how thin the walls truly are, how silence can hide screams, how danger can live next door without anyone suspecting a thing. The second phase of the investigation would dig deeper into psychological motives, into relationships, into the dynamic between the suspects, and into the silent world Sam was trapped in for 30 long days. But before those answers emerged, investigators had to confront an even harder truth. The question wasn't just how this happened, but how long the darkness had been growing before it finally surfaced. As investigators pushed further into the suspects' histories, something unsettling began to emerge. Not a single defining event, but a landscape of small, disjointed moments that hinted at instability long before Sam ever encountered them. None of these moments alone would have raised alarms, but taken together, they painted a picture of two people teetering at the edge of something dangerous. People who'd crossed paths with the quieter suspect described him as someone who moved through the world with a kind of hollow detachment. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't engage in casual conversation. He existed in rooms without really being in them. One former coworker said he seemed like a person who never fully woke up, as if his mind stayed locked behind a door no one else could open. Nothing threatening, just eerily disconnected. The more outgoing suspect was the opposite. His presence filled space, sometimes aggressively. He had a reputation for volatile moods, friendly one day, agitated the next. He drifted in and out of jobs, bounced between friend groups, and often left a trail of unresolved arguments behind him. Some people remembered seeing him pacing the block late at night, muttering to himself. But this is New York. People mutter all the time. What stood out in hindsight was the unpredictability, the way he shifted without warning, like someone whose internal compass never pointed the same direction twice. People began wondering whether these two men formed a dangerous ecosystem, a dynamic where one person's instability fed the other's silence, and that silence, in turn, enabled the instability to grow unchecked. It's not an uncommon pattern in cases involving multiple offenders. Sometimes cruelty doesn't start as a plan. Sometimes it grows in the spaces between two people, one giving permission, the other doesn't challenge. Detectives interviewed those who knew the suspects, trying to piece together their relationship. Most people said the two had little in common. They weren't close friends. They didn't seem to trust each other. They shared rent, shared space, but not emotionally. And yet, despite this, something bound them together in a way no one could articulate. Proximity alone doesn't explain a crime like this. Online psychologists suggested the possibility of a behavioral spiral, a gradual descent where each person's presence encourages the other's worst impulses. In such dynamics, cruelty becomes a form of communication, an unspoken language born from shared dysfunction. It's not about dominance or submission. It's about resonance. Two fractured minds vibrating at the same frequency until something breaks. Whether that's what happened here remains unknown because the suspects refused to speak about their relationship. Their silence created a vacuum the public desperately tried to fill. While investigators searched for motive, the timeline of Sam's captivity remained one of the darkest mysteries. How exactly do 30 days pass without intervention? How does a person suffer in the next room while neighbors cook dinner, take showers, laugh at movies, and complain about the weather? That's the unnerving part. How horror can blend into the fabric of everyday life without disrupting its rhythm. New York is a city made of noise. Walls are thin, floors creak, plumbing hums, people yell, dogs bark, music blasts through vents. In that chaos, it becomes easy to justify strange sounds. A thud becomes a dropped object. A muffled cry becomes a TV show. Silence afterward becomes reassurance. It's not negligence. It's survival in a city where constant alertness is impossible. When neighbors were interviewed, several described moments that didn't seem significant at the time. Short bursts of noise, a quiet argument, sudden stillness. One neighbor recalled waking up one night to the feeling of unease, the kind that sits heavy in your chest. She didn't hear anything specific. She just felt wrong. But what do you do with a feeling? Nothing. You roll over, close your eyes, and let your brain convince you that everything is fine. That's how horror hides, not in loud alarms, but in the quiet moments people talk themselves out of. Meanwhile, online communities dissected every rumor. Some speculated that the suspects isolated Sam intentionally during hours when neighbors were at work. Others believed they controlled him psychologically, not just physically. A few pointed out that prolonged torture requires not just cruelty, but organization. You don't accidentally hold someone captive for a month. You have to commit to it. And that commitment is what people struggled to comprehend. When the first official details leaked, they confirmed what people feared. The environment suggested patterns of abuse, not accidents. There were restraints. There were signs Sam had been kept alive deliberately. Investigators refused to reveal specifics, citing the graphic nature of the evidence. But their silence said more than disclosure ever could. What investigators did share was that the room where Sam was found felt staged but decaying. Not staged in a theatrical sense, staged in the way people fall into routines, small, repetitive actions that become habit. It implied that the suspects weren't improvising. They'd settled into a rhythm, a cycle, a warped version of domestic life where torture became a daily chore. That idea sent shockwaves through the public. The notion that two people could wake up each day, step over the threshold of that room, and continue the same pattern for 30 days defied understanding. Cruelty on that scale doesn't grow overnight. It grows in increments as empathy erodes and power becomes intoxicating. One criminologist put it this way: some people don't become monsters instantly. They chip away at their humanity one decision at a time. What's unclear is the first decision, the moment when everything crossed the point of no return. Was it premeditated? Was it opportunistic? Or was it the result of an argument that spiraled far beyond what either man could control? Investigators have never released that trigger moment. They've never said whether Sam walked into danger unknowingly or whether danger walked toward him. That lack of clarity adds another layer of terror because it means the beginning of the story could look like anyone's ordinary day. In the aftermath, reporters swarmed the building, interviewing residents who suddenly realized they'd been living next to something inhuman. Some described the atmosphere as heavy in the months leading up to the crime. Others recalled nothing unusual at all. It's as if the apartment existed in two realities at once. One where life continued normally, and one where a nightmare was unfolding behind a locked door. Then came the moment investigators faced the suspects directly. Detectives who were present said the contrast between the two was disturbing. One remained completely silent, staring at the table in front of him as if everything happening around him was an inconvenience. The other oscillated between arrogance and confusion, speaking in circles, contradicting himself, shrugging at questions that should have elicited emotion. Neither asked about Sam, neither expressed concern, neither reacted to the gravity of the accusations. Their body language told investigators everything they needed to know. These were not men overwhelmed by guilt or fear. They were unreachable. That emotional void forced investigators to rely entirely on evidence, because psychological insight was impossible. The suspects gave nothing, no explanation, no timeline, no remorse, and that silence created a second kind of violence, one directed at the truth itself. Detectives had to reconstruct Sam's final month through fragments, digital traces, environmental clues, patterns of injuries, receipts, witness statements, and the quiet, haunting details left behind in the apartment. But even with all that, there were still questions without answers. Were there moments when Sam tried to escape? Were the suspects always together? Or did one leave the other to maintain control? Was this crime born from shared intent or shared dysfunction? And perhaps the hardest question, did either suspect ever hesitate? Investigators couldn't say, The evidence was clear about what happened, but unclear about why it happened. And that's the part that breaks you when you think about this case. The why is a void. There are stories where you can trace the path back. Stories where motives make the horror comprehensible, even if they don't justify it. But here, the path disappears the closer you look. You don't find triggers or grudges or elaborate plans. You find silence. You find unpredictability. You find two men whose psychological landscapes remain locked away. As detectives continued piecing together the story, they began to realize something chilling. Sometimes the most terrifying motive is no motive at all. Sometimes cruelty doesn't need a reason. Sometimes it grows in people who lack the internal barriers that keep the rest of us human. And that brings us to the darkest part of the investigation, the part where police had to figure out how two people could sustain such violence for so long without cracking. That answer wasn't obvious, and the path to uncovering it would lead investigators into a psychological terrain as disturbing as the crime scene itself. The deeper investigators pushed into the psychological side of the case, the more disturbing the landscape became. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime. It was the way the suspects seemed to orbit around each other like two unstable planets locked in a gravitational pull neither could escape. People wanted to understand what kind of relationship could allow something like this to happen. But the truth is that some relationships don't begin as dark partnerships. They descend into them quietly. Psychologists examining the case emphasize that dual-offender crimes often defy simple explanations. There's rarely a clean hierarchy, rarely a clear leader and follower. Instead, these relationships tend to form out of shared deficits rather than complementary traits. One may lack empathy, another may crave control, and together they create an environment where cruelty feels normalized, not because they plan it, but because neither one stops it. In this case, the suspects seem to embody two different shades of dysfunction. One with a chilling emotional void, the other with volatile impulses. Alone, they might have remained unstable, but contained. Together, they became something else entirely, something neither could have been without the other. It's as if their flaws interlocked in exactly the wrong way. Detectives interviewing people from their pasts heard stories that didn't initially sound alarming. Small acts of insensitivity, sudden anger over minor inconveniences, instances where one suspect pushed boundaries and the other looked on silently. Someone recalled the quieter suspect watching an argument unfold with a blank expression, not stepping in, not reacting, just observing, as if taking mental notes. That kind of emotional flatness isn't criminal, but it can be a concerning sign when paired with someone unpredictable. The outgoing suspect's past was filled with tension, jobs left abruptly, friendships ending suddenly, a few confrontations that never escalated to legal trouble, but left people uneasy. He had an intensity that fluctuated sharply, sometimes charming, sometimes hostile, sometimes detached, in a way that made people wonder if anyone truly knew him. But even with these anecdotes, nothing predicted what they were capable of together. The escalation from dysfunctional roommates to co-offenders in a month-long torture case was a leap no one in their circles could have imagined. And that unpredictability is what haunts people most. Investigators theorized that the suspect's shared environment may have nurtured their worst impulses. The apartment itself became a psychological pressure cooker, a small, claustrophobic space filled with tension. People underestimate how environment shapes behavior. A cramped apartment with poor lighting, constant clutter, and little privacy can erode even stable minds over time. For unstable individuals, it can become a breeding ground for something much darker. Inside those walls, the suspects seem to have developed a rhythm, a twisted, self-reinforcing system where cruelty became the outlet for frustration, boredom, and emotional voids. The longer it continued, the easier it became. Routine is powerful, even when the routine is monstrous. And that's the part people struggle to accept, that a crime so horrific can grow out of mundanity. Investigators concluded early on that the torture wasn't spontaneous. It was repetitive, consistent, structured. That implies intent, not necessarily premeditation, but a willingness to maintain harm day after day. That willingness is what makes this case so psychologically horrifying. But even with these insights, one question kept emerging. Why Sam? There was no evidence he had a history with the suspects. No sign of conflict. No known grudges. Some people speculated that he might have entered the apartment willingly, not realizing the danger. Others believed he was lured. Investigators didn't confirm either theory, but the idea that someone could step into a room thinking everything was fine, only for the door to close behind them forever, is enough to make anyone uneasy. Then there's the possibility that Sam wasn't chosen for who he was, but simply because he crossed paths with the wrong people at the wrong time. That randomness is terrifying. We want to believe evil follows patterns, revenge, jealousy, greed, obsession. But sometimes cruelty is opportunistic. Sometimes the victim is simply the person who happened to be there. As the investigation progressed, detectives uncovered evidence that suggested a struggle early on, signs that Sam may have realized too late that something was off. But after that early moment, the room became its own sealed world, one where time stretched and warped, one where survival depended not on escape, but endurance. The signs of prolonged captivity were unmistakable, according to insiders who later spoke anonymously. The room lacked natural light. The mattress was worn unevenly. There were marks on the floor that suggested restricted movement, and the objects left in the room, ordinary things like water bottles, clothing, food containers, were arranged in a way that hinted at repetition, not chaos. People often imagine torture as a series of violent moments, but the reality is more insidious. It's the monotony that destroys a person, the slow unraveling of identity, the constant awareness of confinement, the sound of footsteps approaching, not knowing what each step means, the psychological torment of being utterly dependent on people capable of harm. Investigators piecing together Sam's final month described the timeline as devastating. Every day he was alive in that room was another reminder of how close the suspects lived to normal life. They likely left the apartment at times, went to stores, bought food, walked among people who had no idea what was happening behind the locked door they'd returned to. There's something deeply disturbing about the thought that the suspects may have navigated everyday tasks, buying groceries, holding conversations, scrolling through their phones, while someone suffered just feet away from their couch. That level of compartmentalization is rare, and it points to a psychological landscape that most people will never understand. As word spread about the nature of Sam's captivity, people reacted with disbelief. How could two men sustain such cruelty in a city packed with millions of people? How could no one notice? The internet was flooded with anger, fear, guilt, theories, and pleas for justice. But behind all that emotion was a simpler truth. Most people can't fathom that evil can coexist with the ordinary. That's why this case struck such a nerve, because it dismantled the illusion that danger announces itself. It showed that horror doesn't always come from shadows or strangers in alleyways. It can come from the apartment next door, from people you nod to without thinking. The suspect's interrogations gave investigators little to work with. One stared blankly, the other rambled incoherently. Neither offered clarity. Combined, their silence and contradictions formed a psychological wall that made the investigation even harder. Without confessions, detectives had to rely entirely on evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. It suggested not only violence, but intent, not only cruelty, but endurance, not only harm, but structure. Psychological experts suggested the suspects may have formed a dynamic where one's emotional emptiness allowed the other's volatility to escalate unchecked. In such pairings, cruelty becomes a form of shared expression, a way for both to feed something broken inside themselves. But even with these theories, no one could pinpoint the spark that lit the fire. The beginning remained elusive. Meanwhile, the detectives faced the challenge of presenting the case without releasing details too horrific to make public. They had to protect the dignity of the victim while ensuring justice. That balance required silence, frustrating for the public, but necessary. As the story grew, people began reflecting on their own lives. How well did they know the people around them? How many neighbors did they recognize by face, but not by name? How many sounds had they ignored late at night? How many moments had they brushed aside because they didn't want to get involved? These questions cut deep because they forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about modern life. How isolated we can be, even in crowded places. How self-contained our routines become. How easy it is to disconnect from the world around us. Sam's story reminded people of the fragility of safety. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet safety we assume every time we close our door. It showed that sometimes evil doesn't erupt loudly. It spreads silently. It grows in the cracks of neglect, in the blind spots of community, in the thin spaces between awareness and assumption. Painfully, inevitably, the investigation reached a point where detectives couldn't delay releasing certain details any longer. The public pressure had grown too loud. People wanted answers. Families wanted closure. And so, slowly, cautiously, investigators began sharing the broader picture. Not specific injuries, not graphic descriptions, just enough to confirm what everyone feared, that Sam's final month was marked by prolonged suffering, deliberate harm, and an environment of control. The suspects were charged accordingly. The legal system moved forward, albeit cautiously, knowing the case would draw intense public scrutiny. It wasn't just another crime. It was a community wound, a story that seeped into conversations, nightmares, and quiet moments when people found themselves double-checking their locks. And yet, despite the charges, despite the evidence, despite the national attention, the central mystery remained. What brought these three men together? What moment turned an ordinary day into the beginning of a month-long nightmare? That mystery would deepen as investigators uncovered the final details of the timeline, details that revealed just how long Sam's suffering went unnoticed, how deeply the suspects hid their actions, and how the final hours unfolded before the police broke through the door. As investigators dug deeper into the final stretch of the timeline, they realized the last days before the police entered the apartment held the most crucial answers, and the most painful ones. The story didn't unravel with a loud event or dramatic discovery. It came apart through small inconsistencies, subtle changes in behavior, and quiet moments that, in hindsight, meant everything. The timeline revealed something chilling. There were pauses, moments where the suspects left the apartment, moments where they returned, moments where the apartment fell into eerie, unnatural silence. These pauses weren't long, never enough to draw attention, but they suggested the suspects maintained a semblance of normal life during the 30 days of captivity. They bought groceries. They took out trash. They answered the door for deliveries. They existed among people without giving any visible sign of the horror they were hiding. One investigator later commented off record, "It's the compartmentalization that gets you, the ability to do something so dark and then walk outside like it never happened." This kind of emotional detachment isn't common. It's a trait seen in a small fraction of offenders, people able to switch between cruelty and normalcy with disorienting ease. Whether this was a shared trait or a learned dynamic is still unknown. Meanwhile, digital forensics uncovered an unsettling pattern. During the month Sam was missing, the suspect's internet activity didn't reflect panic or attempts to cover tracks. Instead, their searches were mundane: streaming services, food deliveries, random browsing, as if life inside that apartment followed an unnerving duality: violence in one room, normalcy in the next. This discrepancy created a puzzle that investigators had trouble reconciling. How could two people maintain such a facade while concealing such horror? Some experts suggested the suspects may have detached from the reality of their actions, viewing Sam not as a person, but as something else entirely, something that fit into their warped dynamic, something that didn't trigger empathy or guilt. Others believed the suspects fed off each other, creating a psychological echo chamber where cruelty became routine. In such environments, empathy erodes quickly, reality bends, violence becomes normalized because there is no voice to oppose it. Regardless of the explanation, the final days inside the apartment were marked by tension, both visible and invisible. People living in the building reported sensing an atmosphere shift. Nothing concrete, just a strange, heaviness, an unspoken pressure. One neighbor said she heard a single thud late one night, not loud, not alarming, but followed by a silence so absolute it made her heart race. She told herself it was nothing, that strangers in a crowded building shouldn't be the reason she loses sleep. She made tea, turned on the TV for background noise, and forced the feeling away. That detail, forcing unease away, became a theme in the building. Many people later admitted they had moments where something felt off. A door closing too quickly, a muffled argument, a sudden drop in noise. But these moments didn't present themselves as danger. They came as small, fleeting instincts. And instincts are easy to dismiss when life is loud and responsibilities press on you from every angle. Investigators also traced the suspect's purchases in the days leading up to their arrest. Nothing unusual. Food, drinks, basic items. But one purchase stood out, not because of what it was, but because of when it occurred. A delivery was made to the apartment just 24 hours before the police discovered Sam. And yet, neither suspect acted like people hiding something. They opened the door, took the package, thanked the delivery worker. The interaction lasted seconds, just long enough to reveal how terrifyingly normal they appeared. This detail haunted investigators. It implied the suspects maintained control with such confidence that they didn't feel the need to behave differently. They weren't anxious. They weren't frantic. They behaved as though nothing in their apartment needed hiding. That calmness suggested one thing. They believed they were untouchable. But something changed on the final day. Investigators still haven't revealed what triggered the police presence, whether it was a tip, a wellness check, a neighbor's call, or a different alert entirely. That part remains sealed, likely to protect the person who intervened or to maintain the integrity of upcoming legal proceedings. What is known is that officers approached expecting something minor. Nobody walked up those stairs anticipating the discovery of a month-long ordeal. Police described the hallway as still, the air unusually stagnant. Even small details, like a light flickering above the door, took on meaning later. As officers knocked, there was a delay, not the kind caused by fear or hesitation, more like annoyance, a shuffling sound, a muffled voice. Then the door opened just enough for one officer to glimpse the interior, enough to feel something wrong, but not enough to identify it. The suspect who answered acted irritated, as though the officers were interrupting a routine. His expression was flat, his tone sharp. He didn't ask why they were there. He demanded answers, as if the roles were reversed. That attitude raised red flags instantly. Officers pressed further. One stepped forward, noting an odd smell, subtle but unmistakably wrong. Another officer noticed something about the suspect's hands, though that detail was never disclosed publicly. Whatever it was, it shifted their posture. The interaction became less casual, more controlled. When officers finally stepped inside, the air changed. Many crime scene investigators talk about feeling a scene before they see it, an instinct, a heaviness, a sense that something went terribly wrong. That's exactly what the officers described, an atmosphere so dense with dread that even the silence felt violent. The apartment's layout forced them to move through narrow spaces, each step revealing More clues that something was very, very wrong. A table out of place. Furniture pushed oddly to one side. An open door leading to a darkened room. When they reached the bedroom, everything stopped. The discovery of Sam wasn't something they revealed to the public. They spoke around it, using words like disturbing, traumatic, beyond comprehension. But those words only hint at the reality inside that room. What we do know is that Sam was found in a condition that confirmed investigators' worst fears. He had not died quickly. He had not been allowed comfort. His final days were marked by suffering, and the room itself reflected it. Officers described the environment as still, as if the room had absorbed every sound that ever happened inside it. One investigator later said, "It was like the air itself was holding its breath." That phrase stuck with people, spreading through social media like frost. After the discovery, everything happened quickly. The suspects were handcuffed, their expressions unreadable. Witnesses outside said one of them looked bored, while the other seemed mildly confused. Neither showed panic, neither resisted, neither asked about Sam. That absence of human response fueled public outrage. People wanted to see fear. People wanted guilt. They wanted something that proved the suspects recognized the gravity of what they'd done. Instead, they saw indifference. Inside the police vehicles, the suspects reportedly stayed silent. No denials, no explanations. No pleas for understanding. Just blankness. A void. Meanwhile, detectives and paramedics inside the apartment worked quietly, carefully, with a kind of reverence that speaks to the worst realities of their profession. No amount of training prepares you for scenes like this. There are no protocols for the emotional toll it takes. When the medical examiner arrived, investigators stepped aside, many of them visibly shaken. Some of them had worked homicide for decades, yet later admitted they'd never seen anything quite like this. Outside, neighbors stared from behind police tape, realizing in real time that something unimaginable had been happening just feet away from their daily routines. Some cried. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some clung to each other, overwhelmed by guilt and horror. One man said, "I walked past that door every day, every single day, and I had no idea." Those words broke millions of hearts when they aired on the news. As police escorted the suspects out of the building, the city had already begun buzzing. Social media lit up within minutes, turning speculation into wildfire. People posted theories, outrage, grief, confusion. The story spread with a speed that made it clear this case would not fade quietly into statistics. At the precinct, detectives tried once more to question the suspects, but again, they met silence. The kind of silence that isn't fear, but emptiness. The more investigators pushed, the more impenetrable the suspects became. They weren't defensive. They weren't angry. They simply offered nothing. No timeline, no explanation, no apology. And so detectives were left with evidence, not motives, with facts, not answers, with a crime so bleak it made people question the very nature of evil. As details trickled to the public, the outrage only grew. People wanted justice, but they also wanted meaning. They wanted the court to answer the questions the suspects refused to. They wanted to understand how two ordinary-looking men could inflict such cruelty for so long. And at the very center of all this, beneath the layers of media noise, legal language, and psychological analysis, was Sam, a human being whose life was stolen with a cruelty that defies explanation. The final phase of the investigation would focus entirely on him, who he was, how he lived, what he meant to the people who loved him, and what the world lost the moment he entered that apartment. But before investigators reached that moment of reflection, they had to face another brutal truth. Some crimes don't break the world with loud explosions. They break it with quiet suffering, with absence, with questions that no one can answer. And this case had one more question left, one that would haunt investigators, neighbors, and the public long after the arrests were made. As the dust settled and the suspects remained silent, investigators were left with only one place to turn for meaning: Sam himself. Every major crime eventually returns to the victim, not because it's easier, but because it's necessary to understand the depth of the loss before the world can even begin to process what happened. And in Sam's case, the loss was profound. People who knew him began speaking out, not in loud, attention-seeking declarations, but in quiet, heartbreaking fragments. They painted a picture the public hadn't yet seen of a young man who lived simply but deeply. Someone who didn't demand much from the world, but gave what he could. Someone who showed up when it mattered, even if he didn't always know how to ask for help himself. One friend said, "Sam wasn't the kind of person who took up space. He just made the space around him feel calmer." That sentence stayed with thousands of people online because it spoke to a kind of gentleness that the world often overlooks, until it's too late. Co-workers described him as steady, a quiet anchor, never dramatic, never chaotic, never the person who made the room tense. He tried to make people laugh in subtle ways, with small comments and dry humor. A few said he was shy at first, but warm once he trusted you. Others said he was the kind of guy who remembered your birthday, even when you forgot his. And that's what made the horror of his final month so hard to accept. People kept repeating the same sentiment. He didn't deserve this. Not that anyone does. But with Sam, the mismatch between his nature and his fate felt almost unbearable. Those closest to him struggled with guilt. They replayed old conversations, wondering if they missed signs. They questioned why they didn't reach out sooner, why they didn't check in, why they let his silence go unchallenged. But guilt is a cruel companion. It shows up long after choices can be changed. The truth is, nothing Sam did suggested he was in danger. Nothing his friends did was wrong. The burden belongs solely to the men who took him. As detectives reconstructed Sam's last known movements before his disappearance, they saw no fear, no conflict, no sign of distress, just subtle evidence that he was moving through his routine, buying small things, making small plans, living life one day at a time. And then, at some point, he crossed a threshold he never returned from. That threshold is the most haunting part of the entire timeline. It represents the moment where normal life dissolved into nightmare. The moment Everything that made Sam who he was, his humor, his friendships, his dreams, was forcibly taken and replaced with suffering. Investigators never disclosed that moment. They held it quietly, knowing it didn't belong in headlines. When the medical examiner pieced together the sequence of injuries, a narrative emerged, one that confirmed the unimaginable. Sam's final month was filled with pain, endurance, and moments of unimaginable fear. But alongside that, there were also signs of resilience, signs that he fought to stay alive, signs that he tried to hold on to hope in ways small and profound. Those details were never made public, but investigators who saw the reports carried them with reverence. They spoke of Sam not as a case, but as a person. And that, in the end, is what this case became. Not a spectacle, not a mystery to be solved, but a stark reminder of the fragility of human life. When the story reached full national attention, something remarkable happened. People all over the country began reflecting on the quiet individuals in their own lives, the ones who don't speak up, who don't ask for much, who fade into the edges of conversations. People realized how easy it is for someone to go missing emotionally, long before they go missing physically. Sam's story became a mirror, a reminder to reach out, to check in, to pay attention to the people who slip into silence. Because silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's the absence of someone who needed help and didn't know how to ask. Community grief grew in waves. Candlelight vigils appeared in front of the building. People left flowers, notes, drawings, photographs. Strangers wrote messages apologizing for a world that failed him. The memorials were quiet, not the chaotic kind you see for celebrities, but the soft, collective mourning reserved for someone whose story became bigger than himself. The building where the crime occurred changed after that. Neighbors began talking to each other. They exchanged numbers. They checked in. They started noticing things they used to ignore. It was as if an invisible barrier had been shattered, one that kept people isolated, even when they lived feet apart. But even as the community grew closer, the unanswered questions grew heavier. Why did the suspects choose Sam? Why didn't they stop? What broke in them long before they crossed paths with him? And most painful of all, was there a moment, even one, where this could have been prevented? Detectives asked themselves that question constantly. So did neighbors. So did Sam's friends. So did strangers following the case online. But the truth is, some tragedies don't offer redemption arcs. They exist as wounds, not because of what could have been changed, but because of what was taken. With the suspects refusing to speak, prosecutors built the case piece by piece, through physical evidence, digital records, timelines, witness interviews, and expert testimony. The charges were severe, reflecting the prolonged, intentional suffering Sam endured. The courtroom was tense, emotionally charged. Journalists described the atmosphere as oppressively somber. People held their breath when the suspects entered the courtroom. They expected fear or regret, or at least discomfort. Instead, they saw the same chilling detachment, the same emotional void. It was as if the gravity of the situation didn't land anywhere inside them. Sam's family didn't speak publicly often. When they did, their words were simple and devastating. They didn't talk about revenge or anger. They talked about memory, about wanting Sam to be remembered for who he was, not for what he suffered. They fought to preserve his identity beyond the crime, to protect his humanity. And that's perhaps the most important part of this story. Sam was not defined by the last month of his life. He was defined by the years before it, by the people he touched, by the quiet kindness he offered, by the simple, gentle life he lived. His death illuminated something dark about human nature, but his life reminded people that gentleness still matters, even in a world that can be unbearably cruel. In the months following the arrests, the case sparked national conversations about mental health, community awareness, and the hidden dangers of isolation. People questioned how well they knew their neighbors, how often they ignored their instincts, how easily silence can mask suffering, both inside and outside the home. Thousands of people who had never met Sam carried pieces of his story with them. Some lit candles, some shared posts, some talked openly about their own experiences with loneliness, fear, or trauma. In a strange way, Sam brought people together. His loss created a ripple of awareness, a reminder that looking away is easy, but noticing matters. Investigators concluded their work, but the emotional impact lingered. It lived in the quiet moments when someone hesitated before dismissing a strange sound, in the way people paid closer attention to the quiet individuals in their lives, in the recognition that danger doesn't always come from the shadows. It can live in the apartment next door, hidden in silence. And that's the legacy of this story. Not the crime, not the suspects, not the unanswered questions, but the reminder that every human life carries weight, that every act of kindness matters, that every instinct to check on someone should be honored. Sam's story became a call to awareness, a plea for empathy, for vigilance, for connection, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because the world failed him in ways we can't undo, but his memory can teach us to do better, to see more, to care more, to notice. As the public slowly shifted from shock to grief to reflection, one truth crystallized. This case was never just about darkness. It was about the light that should have protected him, the light that flickered too late. And in that truth, there is a haunting lesson that stays with you long after the details fade. Some stories don't close the way you want them to. Some stories stay open, breathing, whispering, reminding. This is one of them. And even now, long after the sirens faded and the headlines moved on, the echo of this tragedy remains in every quiet hallway, every ignored instinct, every gentle person who walks through the world unaware of how precious their presence is. Sam deserved to grow old. He deserved ordinary days. He deserved to be safe. His story is a reminder that we owe each other more than silence. We owe each other awareness, compassion, and a watchful eye. Because evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides. Sometimes it slips by unnoticed until it's too late. And that is the part of this case that no one will ever forget. When stories like this end, they don't really end. They stay with you. Maybe not in every waking moment, but in quiet ones, in late-night thoughts, in the way you look at people you don't know, in the way you pay attention to the world around you just a little more carefully. Sam's case is one of those stories that forces us to sit with uncomfortable truths about danger, about human nature, about the cracks in the world we live in, and about how sometimes the monsters aren't hiding in forests or abandoned houses. They're behind doors we pass every single day. But remembering Sam isn't just about fear. It's about awareness, compassion, a reminder that the quiet people in our lives matter more than we realize. That checking in, paying attention, speaking up, those things can save lives. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Truly, these stories are hard. They're heavy. They demand emotional energy to sit through. And the fact that you're still here means you care about understanding the world in all its light and all its darkness. And if you want to keep exploring these cases with me, if you want more deep dives, more psychological breakdowns, more mysteries that twist your stomach and pull you in, then take a second right now and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. It tells YouTube that these stories matter, and it makes sure you never miss the next one. While you're here, hit the like button too. It boosts the video, pushes it to more people, and lets me know you want more long, immersive true crime breakdowns just like this. And if you're still in that headspace where you want to keep going, if you want another case to sit with, another rabbit hole to fall into, check out the other videos on the channel. Some are just as mysterious. Some are even darker, but all of them are crafted with the same care, the same depth, the same dedication to telling the story the way it deserves to be told. So, stay curious, stay aware, and stay safe. I'll see you in the next one.